Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. When I'm recording this, we're at about the halfway point through the quarter. This is a good time to check your points, especially if you're watching this a little bit after. I record it like a week after. This is a good time to check your points and make sure that you have at least half the points for the grade that you want. This is the last lecture in Module C, and we will be heading west in the next lecture. The title of this module, without the bits and parentheses on the Canvas site, is really just Land and Labor. That brings us to the full title of the module, but without the parentheses around any parts. Ideas about land and labor, or non-labor, have been central to the formation of hegemonic American culture. We've explored why independence meant owning land to the early modern British colonists arriving in North America. And we paid particular attention to how that belief, land as independence, and the specific groups of English people who colonized different regions of North America created patterns of class, race, family, and gender that varied by region from the very beginning of colonization. I've also mentioned many forms of labor, although without always specifically pointing them out as belonging to the category labor. Productive labor is exactly what it sounds like. The person working produces something. Examples from this class so far include producing tobacco, barrels, and small beer. Reproductive labor includes literal reproduction or having children, but it also encompasses all of the work required to keep a group of people, including those children, alive and functioning. The Chesapeake colonies started immediately with the hegemonic idea that not only did land equal independence, but more land equaled higher status and more power. But the more land a Chesapeake colonist owned, the less labor he actually did on that land. English settlers in Virginia and Maryland codified, meaning wrote into law, heritable chattel slavery on the basis of ancestral origin to supply most of the productive labor of plantations. The creation of racialized chattel slavery made a captive labor force by relying on the reproductive labor of the enslaved. And again, I recommend the Morgan article in the readings for this module. The first English settlers to the Chesapeake were mainly men, and many of them privileged men. These men experienced an incredibly high death rate. There were reasons specific to the Chesapeake region that account for the high death rate in these colonies, largely a climate that favored disease organisms and their vectors, like mosquitoes. But it did not help that the first group of Englishmen that came to the Chesapeake and set the pattern of society were completely inept at the reproductive labor that would keep them alive. The Puritans who traveled to New England differed in important ways from those settling in the Chesapeake. From the Mayflower in 1620, New England colonization included individuals skilled in both productive and reproductive labor. And for the initial Puritan colonists, there was a good deal of overlap and coordination of labor of all kinds within a household. The English men who came to the Chesapeake were either indentured servants, in which case they were expected to do whatever labor was asked of them, or men who claimed land and thus independence. Those Englishmen fortunate enough to start building large plantations in the Chesapeake from early on did not perform labor, not productive labor, not reproductive labor, partly because they just didn't want to, and partly because any labor would lower their perceived status to one another. Among the freedoms that came with land ownership for the forming Chesapeake elite was freedom from doing any work on the land that they owned. Once English women began to arrive in the Chesapeake in significant numbers, the pattern of less labor equals higher status held for them as well. The wives of wealthy plantation owners did as little reproductive labor as possible. Enslaved people supplied most or all of the reproductive labor of the plantation owner's household, in addition to the reproductive labor performed for their own households. Enslaved, usually women, cooked, cleaned, did laundry, ran errands, waited at table, and more in the so-called big house. In fact, many upper-class white women in the Chesapeake also offloaded as much of the literal reproduction part of reproductive labor as possible. The wives of plantation owners gave birth to the sons who would inherit land and money, but enslaved women cared for the children, including, in many cases, wet nursing or supplying breast milk for the enslaver's baby from their own bodies. English colonists in New England also equated land with independence, but in a different way. The idealized goal in New England was a small family farm, with a man as head of the household in theory, if not always in practice. The male head of the household who owned land felt that he was independent, that he could theoretically survive on his own. Now, let's be clear. The New England farmers depended on the larger colony. None of these men would have survived without the goods produced by the labor of other farms or produced elsewhere and brought to the colonies by merchants and traders. Even more, the head of the household depended on the reproductive labor of others, of wives, children, and servants, just to survive. In that sense, male English colonists up and down the eastern seaboard of North America considered themselves independent because they owned land and because they controlled the labor of others. One of the major shifts we will see as the course goes on is a transformation in the meaning of independence to cover the ownership of one's own labor rather than exclusively or even principally land. And we will see some massive additions to the concept of what counted as productive labor and the social meaning of wages. What will not change is the reliance of the entire system on many individuals, free and not free, who supplied the reproductive labor necessary to keep those who considered themselves independent alive. This is the title of today's lecture, Gendered Conflicts in a Populous New England, Inheritance, Coverture, and Witchcraft. The Salem witch trials are one of the topics that people often expect to learn about in this class. People not in history tend to start from an idea that the trials in Massachusetts in 1692 to 3 can only be explained by invoking some temporary and major aberration. I've heard mass psychological breakdown explanations and fungi that grow on wheat causing hallucinations, but we really do not need to turn to major and fairly unlikely events to explain what happened. We just need to put the Salem witch trials into a clear historical context. And as it happens, a big part of the context is understanding changes in constructions of gender in both Old and New England. We will start off looking at the ideas of witchcraft in England and relating that to the religious and political changes we saw in the last lecture. We looked at the earliest Puritan settlement in the last lecture as well. We will be adding a bit, covering how the New England colonies changed from the 1640s on. In 1656, a woman named Anne Hibbins was tried, convicted, and executed for witchcraft in Boston in the Massachusetts colony. The trial and execution of Hibbins marked a tipping point in the New England colonies. This is not because Hibbins was tried for witchcraft. Prior to Hibbins, 16 witchcraft trials had already taken place in New England, and 9 women and 1 man had been convicted of witchcraft and hanged. The execution of Hibbins was different because Hibbins herself occupied a different place in the social structure of New England than the group accused of witchcraft prior to her. Hibbins' execution is interesting to us in this class because it marks a hardening in constructions of gender as the New England colonies grew and solidified. The execution of Hibbins marks our first tipping point in this lecture. The Salem witch trials themselves mark the second tipping point. We've been seeing that the period of initial colonization of the Americas corresponded to massive disputes over religion, royal succession, boundaries, and power in Europe. It is in this ferment and violence that witch trials in Western Europe reached their peak. If someone reminds me, I will put a PDF of this timeline under readings for Module C on the Canvas course site. If you want more time to look at the details, you can see it better there, so don't worry too much about them here, but do listen to what I'm saying. Above the timeline are events that happened in the English colonies of North America, and below are events that happened in Europe, particularly England. Parliament made witchcraft a capital crime, meaning it was punishable by death, back here in 1542, around the time that England was starting to be pulled in different directions by religious conflict. The colors indicate official religion in England along this bar. Don't worry about the different types of Anglicanism in the purple shades unless you are really interested. I wanted to make the point quickly that official religious change in England was even more complicated than I made it sound in the last lecture. The colors also indicate the original religious affiliation of the founders of early modern English colonies in North America. If we move in closer on this end of the timeline, you will see, as I've noted in the previous lectures, as well as this one, that the beginning of really serious English colonization of North America corresponded with a period of religious and political change in all of Europe, including England. When the colonists arrived, their world understanding and identities were fully based on what was going on down here. Once colonists started setting up in North America, they would still have connections down here, but they would also start to diverge because their immediate world was now North America and not England. I've noted that James I, or James VI, just of Scotland, had a thing about witches several times now. He wrote and published his demonology as King James VI of Scotland shortly before taking the English throne after Elizabeth I's death. One of his first projects as King of England was to commission a standard translation of the Bible into English. If you have ever wondered why certain translations of the Bible are called the King James Version, now you know. You do not need to remember who's who here. You can always look that up. I do want you to notice that the period just after James I, under his son Charles I, saw a massive increase in the number of people tried and executed for witchcraft. The parliamentarians removed Charles I's head, clearing the way for Cromwell, a Puritan, to take over England as Lord Protector. If you look at the big timeline, you will see that interest in accusing and trying witches decreased and stayed low to non-existent after this point in England. If we head over to the English colonies in North America, the half on the left corresponds to the first wave of serious colonization, including the Puritans here at 1620. I explained something about the banishment of Anne Hutchinson in the last lecture. I want to remind you that although Hutchinson was officially banished for heresy, she had been a thorn in the side of Puritan leaders, particularly John Winthrop, for a while. Hutchinson's banishment for heresy came just before the frenzy of witch hunting in England. Anne Gibbon's execution for witchcraft occurred as the mania for accusing witches was really disappearing in England. In the North American colonies, we see a frenzy of witch trials culminating in Salem in 1692 to 93. In terms of accusations and executions for witchcraft in Salem, it was pretty much a pale shadow compared to England. But it also happened well after England had moved away from the whole kill the witches thing. After the witchcraft trials in Salem, accusations, trials, and executions of witches in New England basically stopped. We know that as England approached their witch hunting frenzy, the world looked really uncertain and distressing to the English. Conflicts over religion, over politics, over social structure and values. Those conflicts were violent and pretty much impossible to avoid for people at all levels of society. There were still some hiccups in England after Cromwell, but nothing like the fear and uncertainty there had been before. Most people were just happy to get back to drinking, dancing, singing, and celebrating the seasons with maypoles and Christmas under Charles II. The so-called Glorious Revolution in England occurred in 1688. No one, absolutely no one, died in England's Glorious Revolution. The revolution did end the Stuart reign in England and linked England more closely to the rest of Europe as the Enlightenment changed ideas about pretty much everything. But for the initial New England Puritans, this was not a period of decreasing uncertainty. In fact, it was completely and totally the reverse. The period from around Hutchinson's banishment to the aftermath of the Salem witch trials was characterized by intense uncertainty, anxiety, and outright fear in the British colonies. During the final witch craze back in England in the 1640s, the English in England made no secret of the fact that most witches were women, 90% of those executed, in fact. Nor did they try to disguise the fact that most witches were poor. You will remember that England's lowest classes had suffered serious displacement following enclosure. Wealthy early modern English folk viewed the acutely poor with about the same enthusiasm as the wealthy view the homeless or the unhoused now. Of course, the affluent English were not thinking to themselves, hey, let's get rid of the poor women by executing them as witches. But when anything bad happened that could not be immediately explained, and there were lots of bad things happening in Europe at that point, poor women, especially poor older women, were immediately the most suspicious characters. They might be midwives or healers, or, as was often the case, they might just be poor women without family, struggling to survive. In a world filled with uncertainty, the identification and execution of a witch felt like control over unstable surroundings. It felt like a solid step towards solving at least one set of problems and giving closure. That is more or less the idea of the witch that the Puritans brought with them when they left Old England to come to New England. Before the trial and execution of Hibbons, there had been at least 16 trials for witchcraft, and 9 of those women had been hanged. If you're like me and you remember words by their shape, Hutchinson and Hibbons, they're awfully similar. But Hutchinson is the first one, banished for heresy, went to Rhode Island. Hibbons is the turning point woman executed as a witch. Those executed as witches in New England, following the precedents of Old England, were vulnerable, usually because of some combination of being poor, being female, and being inconveniently located. Anne Hibbons did not really fit the pattern of the English witch. In fact, she had more in common with Anne Hutchinson. There are a ton of drawings from the 17th century, or supposedly of the 17th century, showing women accused of witchcraft, particularly in England, being hanged, burned, and beaten, if you want to look those up. The image on the slide was drawn by one of the early Plymouth Puritans. And aside from the one coming in for a landing who looks pensive, probably because they're concentrating, but not really unhappy, these all look like they're having such a good time. The woman pictured here is not Anne Hibbins, but it was painted in the correct time and place and in the correct clothing. And the only modern illustrations I could find of Hibbins make her look extremely young, conventionally attractive by hegemonic American standards now, and with lots of flowing hair, which couldn't be less correct. So, how was the real Hibbins different to the New England women tried and executed for witchcraft before her? Hibbins was not a poor woman with illegitimate children and no husband. She had been widowed 2 years before her trial and execution. Prior to his death, her husband had been not only a prosperous merchant, but a magistrate in Boston as well. Far from being poor, Hibbins held a sizable estate in her own right. Members of the court that tried her addressed her as Mrs. rather than good wife or goody, and this was a sign of respect for her social position. Not at all like an early modern English witch. So, how was she more like Anne Hutchinson? Her neighbors considered her a, quote, troublesome woman. Moreover, Hibbins had been excommunicated from the Boston church 16 years before her witchcraft trial for her obstinate challenges to religious, secular, and familial authority. I closed the last lecture with Hutchinson, who was banished from the Massachusetts colony ostensibly for heresy, but really because, as one historian has phrased it, quote, her outspoken theological views and her personal assumption of religious leadership had aroused the hostility of many of the colony's leading men. Two of Hutchinson's closest supporters were eventually tried and convicted of heresy. Jane Hawkins, like Hutchinson, was excommunicated from the church and expelled from the Massachusetts colony for heresy. Mary Dyer was a Quaker, so she couldn't be excommunicated from the Puritan congregation because she was never a member. Mary Dyer was banished, but she did not leave the colony, and so the magistrates of the Massachusetts colony had her hanged. None of these women were formally accused of being witches. A woman who was found innocent of witchcraft at trial, and that did happen, could at that early period in New England sue her accusers for defamation of character. But heresy was a fairly easy case to prove against all of them. In England, women who had made a covenant with Satan put Satan in the place of God. Those women were not only harmful as witches, but they were also guilty of heresy. It was a simple thing to imply that if Hutchinson, Hawkins, and Dyer were guilty of heresy in New England, then they might well be guilty of witchcraft as well. John Winthrop, in particular, hated Hutchinson. You may remember Winthrop led the first wave of Puritan pilgrims to North America. He's the one who gave the City on the Hill sermon. When Hutchinson, Hawkins, and Dyer were banished, Winthrop was governor of the Massachusetts colony. He took advantage of a misfortune of Dyer's to suddenly get people thinking along the witch lines. Dyer gave birth to a stillborn baby that had not developed along normal lines. Hutchinson and Hawkins were midwives attending the birth. We talked earlier in the course about the idea of labeling out of the ordinary babies as monstrous births. Winthrop referred to Dyer's monstrous birth and exaggerated the supposed monstrosity. Some English witches might have formed a compact with the devil, but in New England, all witches formed some sort of compact with Satan, and they did this to gain supernatural evil powers. You might also recall that one of the rewards that Satan gave some of his witches was amazing sexual intercourse. Winthrop basically set up the idea that Dyer had given birth to a monster because she had been getting it on with the devil. Nevertheless, Hutchinson and her followers were convicted of heresy, not witchcraft, in 1638. But Anne Hibbins, who shared their sort of outspoken, strong willed character, was accused and executed for witchcraft in 1656. What changed over the decades between? Simply put, immigration from England to North America increased substantially. Recall that the entire point of going to New England for people like Winthrop was to get away from the corrupting influence of others. Recall also that the most committed first wave of Puritans were bundles of anxiety and contradictions. Women were the spiritual equals of men, but they were also supposed to be subordinate to their head of household. Women could interpret the Bible and hold meetings, but if they gained a strong following and threatened the power of men like Winthrop, that was a problem. Women were not just allowed to crave the delights of marriage with their husband, it would be a disservice to God not to do so. And husbands were urged in sermons to make sure that sexual intercourse really was a source of delight for their wives. But sex outside of marriage, that was evil and disruptive. There had been fornicators in the early groups of Puritan immigrants, but the population was small enough that at least the colony could keep track of them and, when desirable, punish them appropriately, usually with flogging or whipping and a fine. Puritan leaders felt less and less in control of their surroundings as the population around them in New England grew. As the population around them grew, so did the lifespans of the New England Puritans. The first wave of Puritans experienced a much higher rate of mortality, both infant and adult, than later waves. The combination of low population numbers and high mortality early on affected patterns of inheritance. Technically, the laws of coverture meant that women could not own property in their own right. But we know from probate court records that a fair number of husbands in early New England did will estates, partial or entire, to their widows. And widows were the only women who were femme sole rather than femme couvert. In other words, they were not under the legal control of a man as long as they did not have to depend on their sons economically. You will recall that Hibbins was a wealthy, independent widow. Inheritance practices of the Puritans became problematic as population numbers and lifespans grew. Unlike the English aristocracy or the Chesapeake elite, Puritans did split up land between surviving family members. Farms grew smaller and land even more valuable. Neighbors got closer to one another, and debates over the boundary between one family's fields and their neighbors became more frequent and more acrimonious. Splitting inheritance and closer proximity came with increasing accusations of neighbors, including for witchcraft. It's not like the Puritans gave up on accusing poor women, they just added others in. Being more fair in context, let's say you just had a huge argument with your neighbor about your property boundaries, and your neighbor stalked off saying something along the lines of, "You'll get what's coming to you." Within a week, your cow's milk sours, your cow dies, or your child suffers a severe fall. You, as an early modern Puritan, might well feel that your angry neighbor had caused your misfortune. As people people became packed more closely together and land became more scarce, more people argued with their neighbors, and there were more suspicious people at the fringes of society. As in England, before the 1640s witch purge, New Englanders felt that there was much outside of their control. Hardcore Puritan leaders like Winthrop had started out anxious about environments that would corrupt the godly folk. Now things were getting worse, not better, in their Massachusetts communities. In England, not all witches were evil, and not all of them signed on with the devil. In the New England view, all witches had made a pact with the devil. And Puritan leaders were certain that the presence of more and more witches, indicated by increasing accusations of witchcraft by neighbors, was a sign that Satan was collecting an army to destroy the colonies of the godly folk from within. Adding together a genuine belief in the wonders of the unseen world, including witches and the devil, with a rising sense of loss of control for Puritans at all levels of society, on top of what was already an internally conflicted and anxious mindset. Adding to all of that, the encroachment of the very types of people that the first wave of Puritans had left England to avoid, as well as pressure on land ownership and contests over borders and inheritance, and you have a fairly potent cocktail. Between 1647, precisely when witch hunting was beginning to die down in England, and 1693, marking the end of the Salem witch trials, New England experienced a growing witch panic. Over those 4 decades, 79 people were accused of witchcraft, mainly in Massachusetts and neighboring Connecticut. On the map, the original Plymouth colony is going off the right side of the image here. The Massachusetts Bay colony is up here to the north, and Connecticut is forming here. This is Rhode Island, and you know that Anne Hutchinson went to Rhode Island when she was banished from Massachusetts. This gives a good sense of how much the population of New England had been growing. We've gone from a little bitty bit here to all of this that, although they might not have been in control, were spreading in enough numbers that they were encroaching on Native American territory more and more and pressing people back this way. I'm showing you this map because there is more to this history than I can include here. And most of it added stress and uncertainty for the Puritans. This map shows conflicting European colonial claims, although it does not show regions claimed by Native Americans. The Massachusetts colony extended up into what is now Maine. The Native Americans in the region were defending what little they had left. The region up here in this heavily contested area experienced fairly frequent and deadly Native American raids. For the Puritans, this was the wild, violent frontier in the mid-17th century. The young women who take up much of the popular imagination now, the girls that are described as being possessed, some of these were serving as indentured servants in Salem because their entire family and everyone they knew had been killed up here. This sort of information fills in an historical context that makes the events of the Salem in 1692 to 93 make some sense. At least as much sense as violence against other folks ever makes sense. During the year of the witch trials, 200 plus people were accused of witchcraft. 30 were found guilty and 19 were hanged. At least 5 died in jail while awaiting trial or verdicts. And then, after May of 1693, pretty much nothing in the way of witchcraft. In 1724, this is much later, right? In Connecticut, Elizabeth Ackley accused her sister-in-law, Sarah Spencer, of witchcraft. Sarah Spencer sued Ackley for defamation of character, arguing that the damage to her reputation caused by Ackley's accusation had destroyed her living, this is a quote, she being a poor and aged widow who for her livelihood did live by her labor amongst her neighbors. Being older and poor and without much support, Spencer was prime witch material by the standards of 50 years before. But in this case, the court threw out Ackley's case, the accusation, awarded damages to Spencer, unusual when the person suing for defamation was indigent, and seriously considered having Ackley and her husband, the accusers, undergo medical examination to see if they were sane. The world had changed, and the Anglophone world had entered the Enlightenment. We will come back to the Enlightenment, but before that, in our next module, we are going to take a look at the same time period, more or less, that we have just covered in this module, but we are going to head west of the Mississippi River. Key points of Lecture 12. The New England and Chesapeake colonies, while both settled by the English at the same time, more or less, formed societies with quite different ideas about social structure. In particular, the two regions began to develop important distinctions in their ideas about freedom's relationship to land. Control over labor, one's own and or another's, will become increasingly important as we move forward in this course. Productive labor, as the name suggests, produces a thing: barrels, tobacco, beer. Reproductive labor includes both literal reproduction as well as the labor needed to keep others alive or thriving: cleaning, cooking, making clothing, childcare, and so on. In the English colonies, the men who owned land also controlled the labor of others. The Chesapeake began to develop an enslaved labor force. New England increasingly stressed a male head of household. In both regions, men who owned land and were considered independent could not survive without both the productive and reproductive labor of others, particularly enslaved people and free women. The Salem witch trials appear less as an inexplicable and unusual phenomenon when put in context. England, during a period of extreme uncertainty in the 1640s, had experienced a witch panic. Hundreds of people, mainly women, most of them poor, were executed. The English immigrants to New England colonies experienced uncertainty and anxiety leading up to the Salem witch panic. This anxiety and stress increased as the population of the colonies increased. The New England witch trials differed from the English ones. In addition to poor women, people with much greater social status could be accused, tried, and executed for witchcraft. Many of these accusations came from neighbors, particularly neighbors who had disputes with the accused. During the initial period of Puritan colonization in New England, women took advantage of the drastic change in surroundings. Women could and did inherit land and control estates in their own right. Widowed women with the means to support themselves were particularly alarming to many Puritan men because these widows were not under even the nominal control of a man. I have used the trial and execution of Anne Hibbins for witchcraft in Boston in 1656 as a symbolic division. In general, before this point, outspoken, opinionated, difficult women like Anne Hutchinson had been convicted of heresy, but not of witchcraft. After Hibbins, accusations for witchcraft of women who were not poor increased. Of course, poor women were still suspicious and accused as well. Witch panic rose in the New England colonies as population increased and Puritans' sense of control, boundaries, and security were challenged. After the intense period of witchcraft accusations, trials, and executions in Salem in 1692 to 93, ideas of witchcraft followed the direction they had taken in England after the height of the witch panic there. Ideas about witchcraft receded. The Anglophone world began to enter the European Enlightenment, and we will get to that, but not immediately. This is a set of witches in movies from 1939 to 2015. I am quite certain that watching these movies and putting the depiction of the witch into the historical context for when the film was made would count as serious scholarship, even if you did not write any of your conclusions down.